Hello everybody and welcome to DebateHub. I'm so excited to be here. Everybody has made it. Somebody's running in at the very last second, but I'm not gonna say who, because I'm a super nice guy. We're not gonna tattle on people in here. For anybody who has... For anybody who's new here, I am Chesh. Welcome to DebateHub. I've got with me Dapper and Jackson, who have both been here before. I'm very excited to introduce you to Daniel. Today we are going to be talking about creationism and evolution, and we're going to be talking about kind of like maybe vaguely scientism, but we're going to be getting a little bit more into that much later in May. So make sure to like and subscribe. There's going to be tons of content coming out here recently and upcoming and coming for the next couple of months. So, rules of engagement. We're going to let Daniel go first and have the honors to introduce himself, tell us kind of a little bit about who he is, what he does, and what his position is. Then we're going to let Dapper and Jackson kind of ping-pong back and forth between each other, as that is how they are wanting to do, about what they, what their position is, and then I'm going to just kind of open the floor to a discussion. We're going to try and be as respectful as possible. There is a little bit of delay in vMix, so if people are over-talking, I will try not to step in as little as possible, but if necessary, just to let somebody finish a point or get like a little thing across. Otherwise, you're not going to hear too much from me. Welcome everybody to DebateHub, and I hope everybody has a lovely, lovely time. Daniel, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Got involved with this because I trolled a comment on the evolution. Somebody was discussing evolution, and I said, I'm not aware of any, science isn't aware of any type of mechanism where genetically there's huge transfers of information to create a new kind of animal. And that's where it got started. Nobody answered me on that, by the way. But anyways, my background is that I'm a general contractor in Arizona. I've been a Christian for 42 years. The first 10 years, I didn't care about this stuff at all. It didn't matter to me, evolution, none of that. I was watching TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network, way back in like 1992, and Hugh Ross was on there, who's an astrophysicist. He's a theistic evolutionist, and he went through Genesis and said this actually means this, and he was putting it with the ages of evolutionists. And I was so excited. And I knew better to go repeating that stuff without checking the Hebrew first myself. And my brother called me, and I blurted it out to him, and he said, Danny, and he was very antagonistic, big evolutionist back then, said either go with science or go with the Bible, but don't try and mix the two and make it sound acceptable. So I thought about it. I said, you know what, you're right. I'll get back to you in 10 years. And at that point, I began to study the whole broad thing. Spent about 3 hours a week for 10 years just looking at all the information. And what that really did was give me a basis through which I can look at the raw data myself and come to my own conclusions. I don't have to have somebody tell me what it all means. Somebody with a political or monetary agenda tell me what that stuff means. And then I spent another 10 years debating it with a lot of scientists online, but this is different because I can't sit there and take 30 minutes and read something they posted and the papers on it and give them an answer. This is so. Anyways, that's where
you were debating it.
I come from. So yes, over usually discussion boards back then. This is before social media was social media. Yes,
the classics, dear to my heart. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, and thank you so much for coming on, because a lot of the times we try to have these kinds of discussions, a lot of times we'll get like one side or the other just refusing to actually engage in the conversation. So thank you so much for joining us.
No.
Dapper, Jackson, you two want to take it away? Did you guys flip a coin?
Do we want to just get into it? Because there was stuff right at the beginning.
We'll do a little bit of an intro. I'll do a little bit of an intro if you don't have much more.
All right, go ahead.
Hey everybody, I'm Dapper Dinosaur. You probably know me from my channel or this channel, or most likely both. There's a lot of overlap there. You probably know Jackson from his channel or my channel or this channel, or all three. I don't know. Jackson does good stuff. Go subscribe to Jackson Wheat. So we are, we form sort of a dynamic duo when it comes to having conversations with young Earth creationists, Jackson and I. And we've had numerous, and I would say overall mostly very successful in the sense that, dialogues, in the sense that I think both we and the creationists in question thought that we had a good conversation. I think everyone learned things. And while we might not have been able to reach agreement with every creationist that we've talked to, I think overall we've always come away, maybe not with Rob, that Rob Groen guy, maybe not him. With everyone else, though, I think we've managed to come away appreciating where they were coming from, they better appreciating where we're coming from, and having food for thought. My position on this whole thing, as well as Jackson, is going to be solidly in line with the current consensus in science. Now, being the current consensus in science does not make a position correct. It doesn't, not being the consensus in science doesn't make a position incorrect. However, what it does mean is that basically all of the experts in the relevant field have said, on the basis of their often lifelong study, that this particular interpretation is the one that best fits the evidence right now, and therefore should have provisional assent. So, I'm not going to argue that there's no God. I'm not going to argue that I know how life first started on Earth. I don't. I'm not going to argue that there's no creator. I don't have a way to establish that scientifically one way or the other. However, I will say that I do think that Jackson and I have some things that we can talk about when it comes to things like kinds, whether that's a meaningful term in the first place, whether things can change from one kind to another, if we can find a definition for kind that's actually something that is not just verifiable, but also falsifiable, importantly. And so I'm looking forward to getting into those topics, because I think that both Daniel and we two here will have some interesting points to talk about when it comes to things like kinds, and whether things can go between kinds, or whether that's even a question that is a meaningful question to ask, because that is another thing that often comes up. Is it actually meaningful to say whether or not organisms are divisible into kinds, and whether they can cross between them? So yeah, that's all I have.
All right, perfect. I think that's a pretty good intro. I think everybody kind of understands where everybody else is coming from, right? Does anybody have any solid questions right out of the gate for the purpose of clarification?
I mean, my big one is, what is a kind? Because I hear the term a lot. I don't always hear the same definition used between creationists, which is fine, right? Not everyone has to have the same stipulative definition. But most of the time when I do hear a definition, it's one that doesn't seem like it's actually useful in terms of the discussion. So I think the first order of business really should be to try to figure out, what do you mean, Daniel, when you say kind? And how could we tell if a change between kinds had occurred? What evidence would be necessary to see to make that determination, basically? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, however anybody else uses that term, like answers in Genesis, I don't care. I use it just in a simple term. Dog to cat, lizard to amphibian to lizard. Those are different kinds of animals. Tiger versus bear, different kinds of animals.
Well, that concerns me a little bit, because... Oh, sorry.
Why? Well, I'm just trying to make... because...
Sorry, there's a bit of a delay in vMix. Danny, if you want to finish what you're saying, then Dapper, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
So that concerns me a little bit, and I think Jackson might share this concern, because when you say categories as different as, say, cat versus frog, there is about as much diversity in frog. Dog, or cat or dog. So dog, say, versus frog, right? There's about as much diversity in terms of genetics, morphology, behavior in frogs as there is basically in all of mammalia. So two frogs might be as different from each other as, say, a human is from a kangaroo. And so I feel like if you're willing to put frogs into a possible kind, but then willing to separate out, say, bears from cats, I don't know that you have a definition that could hold up to much questioning. It seems like it's just sort of I know it when I see it, and maybe Jackson has something else that he has besides that. I don't know. Sorry, I'll let Jackson take the next one. Oh, Jackson, I don't think we can hear you. I think you're muted.
No, I just heard him.
Oh, did you?
Now you're muted.
Yeah, I can't hear him.
Yeah, I can't hear him. Are you muted on your microphone?
Jackson, this is a sign from the divine that you were wrong about evolution.
Yeah, let's start with something a little more where you would consider something debatable along the lines you're talking about. The particular animal, you probably know what the name of it is. I don't, but on a lot of the new evolutionary trees, there's an animal that they said was the ancestor of both cats and dogs.
I mean, I don't know of any animal that is claimed to be the ancestor. I do know that the Miacids are, well, Miacid is a weird term, but that animals like Meiosis are morphologically intermediate between caniform and felliform carnivorans, and that
but also,
group
like,
is probably
guys,
ancestral. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, like that's an ancestral group. Like it's not like they're like sitting between the extreme of like cat on one side and dog on the other. They're like, you got cats and dogs up here, and then you've got like down here, you've got like the Meicids, right? So they're ancestral. They have characters that are plesiomorphic or ancestral to both of these groups.
We can't run straight to plesiomorphic, Jackson. We have not said.
That's why I said ancestral.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what does that mean?
Okay, all right, fair enough. Ancestral, yeah. Plesiomorphic
Out with the
more or less
jargon.
means ancestral.
Well, then I would. My claim is still that they don't have that animal that you find as a fossil does not have there's no genetic mechanism within them to eventually evolve into cats and dogs.
Why not? Well, what characteristic do you think like that?
Because you don't see that now. You don't see science. Well, science doesn't see a mechanism for those large additions or transfers of information in the genetics of these animals. Of any animals.
That was actually going to be my question. Was when you say information, because that was one of the things you said early on, and I do apologize because you were referring to my my tweet. That was my tweet at the beginning, and when a bunch of people start jumping on my tweets, I just mute them. So yeah. I apologize for not getting to you on that one. But my response to that would have been to your tweet, and your point here is when you say information, I think information, just like kind, doesn't really mean anything. But I'm happy to hear your definition. What do you personally mean when you say it?
Well, it does mean something. I mean, just for instance, between chimpanzees and humans, how many pieces are difference in the information? People say they're so close, but that there's like 3 million pieces of information difference in the genetic code between both animals.
Out of like 6 billion, yeah. I mean, that's a very small fraction.
But hold on, I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. So, Daniel, are you saying that everything in the genome, every single base pair, is itself information, and that any change or addition to the genetic code would in fact be additional information, or at least a change in the information?
Well, there's enough information in there to adapt to their environment. That's what I read. But there's not enough information. But that doesn't really
answer the question. Because I want to know what you mean when you say information. And when you say that there's about 3 million differences in the information between chimpanzees and humans, I happen to know that that's about the number of base pair differences in the alignable coding regions between Pan troglodytes, the chimpanzee, and Homo sapiens, the human, which says to me that what you mean by information is simply the sequence of the genetic code. And so that whenever that changes, that means that the information has changes. Would you agree to that definition? Okay.
I guess.
So I just wanted to make sure that I knew. I mean, I'm not. It's not a trick question. That's what I'm hearing, and I just want to make sure that if that's not what you mean, that we have a chance to figure out what you are trying to say. And that if that's what you mean, great. But then I would just say every mutation adds new information to a genome.
Yeah, you have mutations that your parents don't have, that their parents didn't have, etc. That your brother didn't or doesn't have, or your cousins, whoever. So every single person has a unique, genome. Everyone's going to have mutations that are not shared by anyone else, right?
If I can just jump in with a clarifying question, so that's how we get like DNA evidence in like forensics, right?
Well, sure. So like with forensics, one of the things you're looking at, or paternity tests, you're looking for things that are like, oh shoot, I'm so mad at myself. They're repeats. So you have like these little like duplicated repeats, and everyone has a very specific like arrangement of them, and that's how you can compare like a presumptive father with the presumptive child or whatever, and say, well, is this or is this not the father? You base it on those like highly variable regions, because it's extraordinarily unlikely that any two people are going to share these highly variable regions. But the point I'm trying to make with this is, since everyone has a very ever so slightly different, set of mutations in their genome, and what Dapper just said up there was that the differences between humans and chimps are these 3 million base pairs, which I believe you said did count as information, right? This is the information difference. Mm-hmm. Right. So there is information difference among all of us, right? And some people are going to have ever so slightly longer genomes than other people. Some people are going to have slightly shorter genomes because insertions and deletions can add variable amounts of nucleotides. So wouldn't like an insertion count as additional information? So you have an additive effect there?
Through breeding. Mm-hmm. Through breeding. Uh-huh. But these animals are not breeding together. Yeah, you're talking massive amounts of information between, a tiger and a bear, and
right.
And if you're going to have that kind of information exchange, it's got to be through breeding, and they don't breed.
So hold on, I'm confused. Do you mean that bears aren't breeding with tigers, or do you mean that bears aren't breeding amongst bears? Okay, so
bears are breeding with tigers.
Right.
They
so
try,
the model that I'm not gonna ask a tiger what it's doing with that bear, but I suspect you're right.
That sounds really risky for everybody involved.
I'm gonna leave that tiger and that bear to do whatever they want, but I'm assuming that you're right here and that they're probably not breeding. Even if they tried, I suspect it would not be successful in the sense of having offspring. But the model that is proposed by evolutionary biology is not that tigers and bears breed together and that explains the differences in the genetic code between them. The idea is that within a population that is breeding, new genetic variation will arise from mutation, and that over time, this population may in fact split into different groups that are not anymore breeding together. And then when that happens, what that means is now the mutations in one group are not shared by the other group, and so they start to diverge. So when you have a group that is breeding together, it tends to even out some of that diversity so that it gets shared around the entire population. But when you have two groups that aren't breeding together, when one mutation arises in one group, it doesn't necessarily arise in the other one, and so you start to get more and more differences between those groups rather than within one group. And that as this happens, those two groups may become different because ultimately, what's the difference between a tiger and a bear? It comes down to the genetics, right? If you had a bear embryo, or not embryo, zygote, right, and you just completely replace its DNA with a tiger genome, you'd probably get a tiger out of that embryo if you could bring it to full term. So that's really what the big difference is, right, is the genome. And so the evolutionary model is just saying that as these genomes, taking the whole population into account, diverge now that they're no longer breeding, they become more and more different. And so when you look at, say, the common ancestor, or something that represents the anatomy that would be expected of the common ancestor of bears and tigers, which would be something like meiosis or the other similar animals that we know of from that time frame, you can see that basically what happens to get you to, say, tigers, is that you get a population that finds things like particular kinds of scent marking more important, particular ear structures evolve that don't even seem to really matter that much in terms of actual auditory acuity. They're just different. That is a thing that's characteristic of cats. You get the evolution of somewhat more flexible shoulder joints, whereas on the bear side, and also in cat side, you also get the going up onto the tippy toes rather than walking on the heel and the flat of your palm like bears do. And on the bear side, you start selecting for things like a stockier build, a more generalized diet instead of the hyper carnivore diet that cats were selected for, a shorter tail. But ultimately, none of those are things that are unknown today because most creationists now will say things like, well, foxes and wolves probably share a common ancestor. Well, okay, but they're very different morphologically. And if we were to project the current differences between wolves and foxes out a few tens of millions of years, I would suspect that they would become as different then as, say, cats and bears are today. And so I think by objecting that we don't see breeding between bears, say, and tigers is to misunderstand the model itself. And I'll shut up now.
Thank you for coming to his TED Talk.
Yeah. Back to Wheaton. First off, why are you calling the differences, for instance, of one human from the next offspring due to mutation? Why are you calling that due to mutation? In other words, if we have a kid,
Okay.
yeah, the child totally looks different. Why are you saying that's due to mutation?
Well, differences in your appearance can be, it can be environmental and it can be genetic. Your appearance is kind of a mix of both.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But so one thing is, so by definition, a mutation is a change that arises when a genome replicates and it is not inherited from ancestral genomes. So for instance, you said that you have a son, so we know that. When you had your son, half of your genome went into the spermatozoa that went to, go on and create your son. But when that divided to create that sperm cell, there were mutations that occurred. There are variations in the genome that your son inherited that are not anywhere in your genome. And those are, by definition, what a mutation is. So when we say a mutation, that's what we mean. It's an aspect of the genome that was not present in the ancestor of that genome, which is one half of your genome, is in fact the ancestor of one half of your son's genome. And so, I mean, when you say, why would we call that a mutation? I mean, that's just what mutations are, right? It's like, why do you call that fluffy white thing in the sky a cloud? That's what clouds are. They're the fluffy white things that are in the sky. I don't.
I've never heard anybody define a mutation that way.
I mean that's just the definition of mutation.
My understanding is that that's. Oh, I mean that's fair. What would be your understanding of what a mutation is? Because maybe that's part of the confusion. Maybe we're just speaking different languages.
A mutation is damaged information. Or
no one uses it that way.
I saw you wrote an article on had an article on the blind fish in the caves. And I've never read anything about that. Maybe nobody's done this. My idea would be to capture some of those and bring them back into the light and see if that is a genuine mutation, to see over generations. If that is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is.
Let him finish.
So it's already been done.
It's
already been done. Yes. So I actually did a video. I was on somebody else's channel. This guy named Aaron Raw, and he had me watch a video by this guy named Big Wave Dave, where he talked about continuous environmental tracking, and he was like, yes, according to this technical paper, it says if you take the blind cave fish, the Astyanax mexicanus, from the caves, and you raise them in light, their eyes just regrow. Well, if you actually go read the paper, which I did because I was like, that doesn't sound right, it says like literally the exact opposite. So what happens is basically, while the fish is developing, and I think we mentioned this in the video, but it's been a little while, I don't quite remember. So while they start developing, there's basically a mutation, or there's a mutation in the eye development program, whatever you want to call it, the set of genes that are involved in building the eye and all those structures, and it basically caps the development. So it kind of just kneecaps the development, and the eye never forms. What's really cool though is you can is because the cave fish don't have eyes anymore, or in any real sense, they've heightened their other senses. So their lateral line system is like super huge, and it covers way more of their body than it does on most fish. They have taste buds outside of their mouths. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to point out, a lateral line system, because not everyone knows, is actually a system of like sensory pores that fish have on their bodies, and that's used mostly to detect things like changes in water pressure that helps them detect things like passing waves or something. It basically, if they can help tell what's moving out there by using this lateral line system, just so we know.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sorry, if you ever need me to, well, you're not dumb, but also if you ever need me to clarify, I do apologize. I'm very used to just going straight to jargon. So if you ever need me to if you're like, hold on, define that word, I'll happily do that.
Well, just so you know, I've always figured that they have developed much broader and more sensitive of the other thing, just like blind people do. They can hear exactly. So actually, it's something that happens over time. But I'm thinking, well, has anybody tried this? First off, that's a lot of generations to see if the cells start to repair themselves within those fish and they start to develop eyes over quite a few generations, like the fruit fly experiment, the great whatever that was back in the 50s. The guy with the fruit flies in a bottle. They all developed the mutation. They developed the mutation, and when they stopped the experiment, they went back.
Well, that's not what. Okay. So basically, what happens with that was the intention for the fruit fly experiment, which was actually like the 19 teens. That was Thomas Hunt Morgan's work. But that was more just to figure out like what genes are involved in eye development. That was like the homeobox or the homeotic. Sorry, not homeobox yet. The homeotic research. Basically, they weren't trying to figure out if these flies could survive in the wild. They were just trying to figure out, well, what genes are... I don't even know if gene is the right word. What traits, what genetic traits are heritable traits are... We have all these nice words now that we can use to like define things that they didn't have back then. It makes it so much more efficient.
This is around the time when the word gene was coined to refer to indivisible, like heritable characters that Mendel was dealing with, and it later on went to be like, well, now we're going to talk about it in terms of like this set of DNA that helps code for a protein. But yeah, so I actually have a question I'm curious about. Okay. If the cavefish were to redevelop eyes, would you see that as confirmation or disconfirmation for the theory of evolution?
Confirmation for variation due to environment, but not to change from one kind of animal to another.
Okay. Well, then
microevolution versus macroevolution. I don't like those terms, but that type of thing.
I also don't like those terms. I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of them either. Yeah, I don't think they're terribly useful. They were coined by someone who was quite wrong about evolution to explain a difference that most evolutionary biologists would tell you just doesn't actually exist, but that he thought existed. And it was part of a debate that has long since ceased to be a debate in evolutionary biology that was occurring. Yeah. Was it back in like the 1930s?
Yeah, 30s, 40s, around there. Yeah, right around the start of the synthesis.
Nearly 100 years ago, a debate that has long since stopped being a debate. But anyway, I think then the question then becomes, well, I'm not still really sure what you mean by a kind. If a fish were to evolve into a different kind, what would that look like?
An amphibian. Just stick with standard textbook.
Can I also ask a question?
High school.
So when you say fish, I've been doing a lot of videos about fish recently. There are a lot of fish, and we are more closely related to some of these fish than they are to other fish. So, like genetically, you are more closely related to lungfish and coelacanths than either of them are to goldfish, for instance. And you're more closely related to a goldfish than they are to sharks, right? So even though these are all fish in the sort of traditional sense of like they're swimming scaly animals with fins, like fish encompasses a lot of things, right? Way more diversity than is like among all tetrapods, basically.
Yeah, right. You're much more similar to a salamander than a salamander is to a goldfish.
Sorry, Jackson. Just to clarify, what was your question?
My question is here. You say fish, but fish is a very large grouping of increasingly distantly related organisms. So, like, when you say fish, what do you mean specifically? Do you mean all fish, or
no? Just fish.
Because like a lungfish going to an amphibian is a lot easier.
I think I might be able to clarify.
Yeah, you're talking about the genetic code is much closer to humans than the genetic code is to say fish to lizards, and that doesn't prove evolution just because it's like that.
Well, I mean that on its own probably wouldn't, I guess, but
Right.
My
issue
to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier with the information thing is like, I don't think we ever really, we got a definition. You mentioned that like mutations count as information, and it seems like
I said that's kind of what you were saying. That confused me. I've never heard anybody use mutations in that way. To me, mutation has always meant something that's wrong, that's destroying that's destroying a little bit of information.
No, so the reason that no one uses it that way is you can have like duplications. A gene duplication is a mutation. It is that's why that's why the word mutation is always defined, or has always been in all the genetics class and whatnot that I've taken, as merely a change in the genetic code. It's very broad because you can have lots of different types of mutations. They can have lots of different effects. That some mutations are bad, as you said, like, cancer is one example, or, cystic fibrosis or whatever. Those are examples of bad ones. Most mutations are neutral. They have no effect on you whatsoever. Like, something very, very, very minor, or they're what's called like effectively, neutral. And then some are beneficial. They actually confer a survival advantage to a population. And we've witnessed this in various laboratory experiments. So that's why the term mutation is very broad. It has to cast a wide net, or otherwise we have to come up with like different words to capture like a beneficial mutation versus a neutral mutation versus a deleterious mutation. Like we have to come up with another term for mutation, which is why I think it's easier just to say mutation, but with this effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so granted
back to the fish. 10 years ago, news, Darwin's finches had all reverted back to a normal beak.
No, that's not what happened.
So,
what you're referring to is a basically there's
I'm putting this with the fish. I'm trying to never mind. Go ahead, explain it.
Well, the thing with the finches was that it was one population that the students of the grants were studying in the Galapagos on Daphne major. It was, I think it was Geospiza. Was it Fortis? Or maybe it was Magnorostris. Anyway, it was one of the finch species. It was basically they were studying one population during an El Nino, and during the dry part, during the wet season. During the wet season, basically these populations were able to have limited interbreeding between each other because you had a wide amount of variability. Basically, if you're a species with a big beak and you had an offspring who had a small beak, you could survive because there was a lot of vegetation. You would do fine. It didn't matter. But then when the dry season came, basically all the variants who were like in between the extremes got wiped out because suddenly the only thing that was left to eat was like the very hard seeds, like the little, frick, I can't remember what they were. They have like spines on them. So you have to either have very
seeds. The place is lousy with cactus.
Well, cactus was one of them, but this wasn't a cactus. It was a different kind of plant. But at any rate, so basically you had the ones who can eat cactus, which was a different species, or, versus the ones who had to eat these other seeds, which were a different species. But everything in between those got wiped out by the dry season because they were too inefficient, right? And so you have this kind of circle around a mean, basically. But that's we do see that sometimes. Like that does happen, obviously, as in that case. But we do also see examples where we do have like divergent selection, like we have selection away from the mean and to a new species. One of the examples
it's happening in North America right now. Apple maggot flies.
Sure.
Where versus
with apple maggot flies,
hawthornberry flies. Yeah, there's currently there's a species right now that are often called apple maggot flies, but sometimes they're called hawthornberry flies. And the reason is that ancestrally, the species of fly would lay their eggs on hawthorn flowers, which are native to North America. And the larva basically is a parasite that just eats the fruit. That's how it, grows up to be big enough to turn into a fly. Is it just eats the hawthornberry. But in, I believe it was the 1790s, a pastor from England brought some apples over because he liked apples, I suppose. And he was like, yeah, I want apples here in the New World. So he planted the first apples that ever appeared in North America. And so since the 1790s or so, some hawthornberry flies have adapted to instead lay their eggs on apple flowers. But there's very little overlap between the blooming season of hawthornberries or hawthorn bushes and apple trees. And so as time has gone on, two populations have emerged in North America which have virtually no overlap in their breeding season. One is the apple maggot flies, one is the hawthornberry flies. And so because these populations of flies are right now starting to no longer breed together, they're starting to diverge genetically. And over time, they will almost certainly become two different species unless, I guess, either apples or hawthornberries go extinct, but neither of them seem to be at risk of that anytime soon. So I'm not too worried about that. So we're watching a speciation event happen right now where mutations are building up. in the hawthornberry flies that aren't being shared with the apple maggot flies. And there are mutations building up in the apple maggot flies that aren't building up in the hawthorn maggot flies. And they're becoming different species in the wild right now. I mean, it's just happening. You can go, if you ever see an apple with a big worm in it that you got from North America, chances are that's one of those flies.
If I can jump in here, I think that's kind of going to lean into that micro versus macro. Like the information to go between one and the other is already there. Particularly with the finches would demonstrate that, basically, from Daniel's point of view. And correct me if I'm wrong, please. But if the finches were already this way and adapted to be this way, then being able to go back to this other thing shouldn't necessarily be a problem in either, both for evolution or for creationism. It should be a non-issue either way. But Daniel, can you get us what you were trying to say about the fish?
Oh, I was just relating the finches to the fish.
Okay.
Well, so the fish could. You're saying the fish could not have eyes currently, and that if you were to take them out of that environment, they would adapt to get eyes again.
Possibly, I don't know.
Sure.
That's just to me. That's an experiment. To me, that's an experiment in cellular development. Will that? Is there something in the fish that will help them repair what they lost because they need it?
I have good news for you. The Institute for Creation Research is currently doing that experiment, and so far, what they have found is that Mexican cave tetras get a bit of a tan when you grow them in the light, which is a result.
Yeah, I'd be very shocked if. I mean, I'd be very shocked if they could, because typically, so there's a. I really hate this phrase, but there's a law in evolution that's called Dallow's law of irreversibility. It's not a law; it's a statistical. It's a statement of statistical probability. It's basically the idea is that once you go down a certain
thermodynamics, Jackson.
No, that's true. That's fair. Like the concept of laws is dumb, but basically the idea is that once you go down a certain evolutionary path, you've accrued a certain number of mutations. The odds that you are able to revert down that path, you're able to. It's like you start at A, go all the way down to B. The odds that you could go from B all the way back to A, and once you've accrued a certain number of mutations, just becomes like pretty small,
very low.
And it's not that they're just simply shutting off all of it's not like it's one mutation where they just shut it off. It's like they get to a point and then it's just physically unable to keep building. They've accrued so many mutations in this particular region that they've destroyed it. It'd be kind of trying to go back to a dinosaur mouth from a bird beak. Is it possible?
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if that's why when they were
birds have broken. The bird gene for enamel is broken. Birds can't make enamel. You can actually get a bird embryo to develop dentin-capped roots. You can get a pulpy root with capped and dentin on a bird in embryo by just switching back on the teeth genes, but they never developed enamel. So yeah, probably not.
I did want to point out with regards to the finches
about birds. I'm sorry.
Oh, that there is actually
it's an interesting.
I'll let you go, Dapper.
It's the V-mix delay. I was going to say, it's just interesting from a biology standpoint that birds, in fact, all birds have the genes to make teeth. They just don't activate them, but they also have a broken enamel gene, which is hard to explain unless birds all ancestrally had teeth. And if they all ancestrally had teeth, and they all, by the way, their enamel gene is broken in exactly the same way in every bird. So if they all started out with teeth, with a functional enamel gene, and they all broke it in the same way, then it should mean that the only really realistic way to explain that is that all birds shared a common ancestor, and that common ancestor of all modern birds had a broken enamel gene. I don't know how else to explain that. And the same thing is true for vitamin C genes and monkeys. So basically all monkeys, including apes, including humans, have a broken vitamin C synthesis gene, which is why they're all susceptible to scurvy. If you don't feed your gorilla enough vitamin C, it will get scurvy, just like any human sailor. And so, with things like that, where it's okay, we're not adding new information by most definitions that I've heard. But on the other hand, it's very hard to explain why such a wide group of animals, like all birds or all monkeys, would have exactly the same damage to exactly the same genes in exactly the same place in their genome, other than sharing a common ancestor where this breakage occurred. And that's it. I'm done. I'll shut up again.
I happened to read that particular scientific paper where they discovered they could turn on the dormant genes in chickens to make them grow teeth. And they're not teeth with enamel. So they're just literally
Right.
ridges. They're just ridges.
Right. But that's the thing, though. They're not just ridges, because we have birds with ridges on their beaks. Like, actually, lots of birds.
Mhm.
Some geese have ridges. There's
sure.
there's the comb. I think it's the comb tooth.
Well, you can see the pictures of them. Yeah, you can
But
see
the
the
thing
pictures
is,
of them.
the difference is, a tooth is a specific structure, right? A tooth is actually, it's a dermal structure, and so when it actually is embedded in the cranium, so in your maxillary and premaxillary teeth, it actually has to.
Hold on. Teeth is just what they called it. They weren't real teeth. They weren't.
No, I'm explaining.
Tooth refers to a specific structure. Tooth refers to a specific structure that is homologous among all vertebrates. Basically, it's like this is one very specific.
Not all vertebrates.
Or all. Sorry, not all vertebrates. All
actual
gnathostomes.
teeth.
All gnathostomes.
Yeah, there you go. Which
but
is
yeah, like,
close to all
yeah.
vertebrates, but not quite.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead,
Like,
Dapper.
The real drama. The real drama.
Lamprey teeth are not teeth.
Yeah. So the reason I'm pointing this out is there is a difference between beak serrations, which is what it's usually called when you get bumps on a bird beak, and actual teeth. And what they have developed are, in fact, teeth. Because a tooth has a particular structure, right? It has a pulp, which has a blood supply and is made of living tissue. Then it has a dentin, which is a primarily proteinaceous covering that helps strengthen the tooth. And then over that, it has a very hard but somewhat brittle enamel coating. And the reason that you have all of these structures is basically for structural integrity as well as keeping it alive, because if your tooth just rots out, well, it's going to fall out, and that's bad. And when these genes are flipped back on in, say, chickens, which is an example of a bird that we've done this experiment on in particular, what develops is the pulp and the dentin, which means it's actually developing a tooth, but it fails to develop the enamel coating. But when you have a bird like a goose with a serrated beak, which actually several geese species have serrated beaks, it's not that unusual. What's actually happening is the keratin, which is its own particular protein of the beak, which is what the beak is primarily made of. It's a keratin sheath around the jaw. That actually has extensions that itself grow out kind of like a fingernail, because your fingernail is made of the same basic chemical as a bird beak. And so when we look at this experiment in, say, chickens, and we look at the genomes of other birds, all of which that we've tested for seem to have these same genes for teeth, there's a significant biochemical and developmental difference between the teeth that we can switch on in embryo and the beak serration, which means they're not the same thing. They're not coded for by the same genes. They don't have the same underlying chemical or anatomical structure. They're not made by the same structures embryologically. And so we remain in this situation where all birds, all of them, have the genes to make teeth, including what would be a gene to make enamel. But because that gene is broken, when you flip on the tooth genes in birds, they start to develop teeth, but they're basically naked. It would be a very painful existence to have teeth that are just exposed dentin, because they would be very susceptible to horrible injuries. And I don't know if you've ever had a toothache, but it is not a fun time. And I would not want to be a bird with a mouth full of aching teeth. That just sounds like torture. So what would creation predict, or how would creation explain, I suppose, is really what I'm asking, the existence of these widespread pseudogenes that seem to just be the remnant of an enamel gene in all birds, as well as the ability of birds to, if the correct switch is flipped, basically an embryo, to just start developing teeth that never quite finish.
The paper emphasized many times could be, might be, maybe leftover dinosaur DNA. And the creationists would look at that and say, well, that's the way they were created so that they can adapt to their environment.
So, okay, God created...
Objectively doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm trying... So, the model that you just seemed to propose to me is that because God wanted birds to be able to adapt, he gave them genes to make teeth, but he intentionally broke all of their enamel genes in exactly the same way, so that even though they could grow dentin and tooth pulp, which is the middle part of the tooth, They can't make enamel, making their teeth that they can switch on useless. So what adaptive ability does this give to birds that they can make teeth that can't actually function in the real world because they're not hard enough to actually be used for food processing?
Well, first off, I don't disagree. Like for instance, I think with one of you guys, we were talking about dogs, and I said German shepherds and whatever bull, whatever the other kind of dog was. I don't disagree that if you were to separate those two, pit bull.
Pit bull.
Yeah, I don't disagree that if you were to separate those two dogs on different continents for thousands of years, that eventually they would not be able to breed with one another, and that kind of speciation that you're talking about. But that doesn't change the fact that they're still dogs, and I would not disagree that. Right, and I also. But
that's the thing. That's evolution.
I also don't disagree.
Evolution.
Well, Dapper, let him finish.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry.
But there's a vast difference between that and that dog turning into a kangaroo eventually.
So those are
an example.
Very different things. Like, so when you say there still be dogs, that's true. We agree with that. I mean, like that is a central aspect of evolution, that monophily is true, right? Like that all dogs share a common ancestor, which itself is a carnivoran, which was a mammal, which was an amniote, which was a tetrapod, blah blah blah. Like, that's a central idea of evolution. We are primates because we have all the characteristics, both genetic and morphological, that are diagnostic of primate. Well, except for Dapper over here, he's a dinosaur. But like the rest of us, we're all primates. Like that's we expect that a primate is never going to turn into a different, currently extant animal. That's just not a prediction of evolution. A prediction.
Pick something besides primate. Then okay, I picked the marsupial, whatever.
Sure, we could go with marsupials. I mean, like a kangaroo is never going to turn into a wombat, right? They're two.
No, because I said a dog. Because I said dog to kangaroo. I said dog to kangaroo.
But that's nice.
I mean, we could say anything, right? Like
one of the confusions
whatever we.
Well, you got to. But the thing is, you have to have a fossil record for that, and you don't.
Well, so we do. I mean, we have a fossil record for dogs, or for canids, we have a fossil record for. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you don't have a fossil record for literally what would have to be thousands and thousands of gradual changes from one kind of animal to another. You have just these. Okay. Here, this is. It looks. We think it probably turned into this over time, and that's the fossil record.
So, I mean, we do have lots and lots. I mean, a transitional fossil is like an organism who has characteristics of the, like, presumed, like, ancestor and descendant, like, clades, right? That's what we mean when we say transitional fossil, right?
If that's what you have, well, no, because you have to have the transitions between that and the other.
So that's where you start getting into things. Well, so if you start doing that, like, oh, well, every time we have a transition, well, you have to find the transition between the next two. Like, that starts moving the goalpost into, like, the moon, basically, and we just can't. Nothing.
Yeah, but they're huge. That's a huge transition.
So,
I mean, you're not talking something that would. Mm-hmm.
Let's take canids, for instance. You mentioned canids. So canids do actually have. They have a fossil record, right? There are like borophagines, and there are lots of stem canids like Hesperocyon, things that are less dog-like than anything around, or less canid-like, I should say, not necessarily dog, because they're basally derived with respect to foxes too. So you have like Hesperocyon, which is basally derived, so it's primitive in its characteristics with respect to all extant canids, right? So that's something we could reasonably say is like, it's ancestral. It's a transitional fossil between earlier, like the Miacids, for instance, some of whom are more dog-like and some of whom are more cat-like. Because Miacid, the group Miacids, is what's called paraphyletic. It's basically a grade. So some Miacids are more dog-like. They're more like Hesperocyon, which is more like our modern canids, and then some Miacids are less dog-like, so they're more like what would have been the common ancestor of like cats and dogs, something like Dormalicyon, or like I forget what the others. It's been a long time since I looked at carnivore and data on this.
Actually, but being able to pull out Dormalicyon is pretty good anyway, so don't feel too bad.
So you have like Dormalicyon, which like is in the Eocene, which has some characteristics diagnostic of carnivorans, like the carnassials. That's a diagnostic character of carnivorans. But At the same time, it does not have all the derived characteristics of either the dogs or the cats, right? So it's got some characteristics in common, not all of them. And then we can pull back further.
But it's just like, I remember watching this PBS show on evolution with my kids once. The guy had 100 skulls laid out on a table. Perfect transition from one to the other. And I turned to my kids and said, those are all modern animals right there. They might have a fossil or two mixed in with them. And sure enough, he says, yeah, these are all. That's not proof. You have to have some kind of way
There's
to
nothing
show
like
that, hey, wait a minute.
Dormalis today.
Well, if I can jump in real quick. So what you're
There's
saying
nothing
is
like Dormalis around today. There's nothing like it around. Like, we
Yeah,
have
but what-
dogs,
Don't
we have
interrupt the
cats.
host, Jackson.
what he's asking for is a near unbroken chain from
If you want
one
that, we can do that, but the organisms
Yeah.
that do that are not interesting to anyone. So, like, we're
Well-
talking about phytoplankton. Like, I guarantee, if you want to talk foraminifera, I am all about it, but
Nobody
nobody
likes
ever wants to talk
plankton.
foraminifera.
Rip.
Yeah, nobody likes
It's true.
phytoplankton.
Rip
Nobody wants to talk
plankton.
about that. I can show you, like...
Let's stick to animals and not plants.
Okay, but that's kind of the point, right? Like, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jesh.
So if you were to go in, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, because I want to make sure that you feel like you get a fair amount of time to speak. You're asking for a near unbroken chain of one kind to another kind, or from one ancestor to two different species.
Either way.
So, we
I mean, I
have
do
things
feel like
like that.
in Dane.
So-
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
We do have things like that in the fossil record. I mean, we even have them for some mammals and some ceratopsians, for instance. For instance, if you look
Yeah, we
at
do.
the chasmosaurines, which are a group... So you have, like, Triceratops, all those guys with the big frill and the horns. So there are some groups of them. One group is called the chasmosaurines. Basically, the chasmosaurines are so well represented in the fossil record that you can actually see species-to-species transitions between them. They're that well represented. So you have, like, Ankylosaurus and Enosaurus and, like, Pachyrhinosaurus. And they're all, like... You can see how they very gradually take the horns, horns right above the eyes, and they, like, slowly, like, kind of... What is it? I don't know if they pull them down or, like, pull them out or whatever. It's basically... They very slightly change them, and you can slowly see that. There is Thalassocnus, the aquatic sloth, who has what's called a chronospecies. So you can see literally, like, they become progressively more aquatic over time. There's that weird goat from Spain, Myotragus, which, like, the eyes. Okay, so it's a goat that ends up on an island, an archipelago, where there are no predators. And so it goes from the ancestral goat condition, which is where the eyes are on the sides of the head because they're prey, and it slowly moves its eyes back towards the front because there are no predators.
Can I just say that I hate that? Can I point out that sounds terrible and I hate everything about it?
Look up pictures of Myotragus. It looks like it wants to ask you 3 riddles for its gold or whatever.
Nope.
But yeah, we have
I want the dinosaur Casio something. How do you spell that?
Chasmosaurine. Chasmosaurine. If you look up... So Chasmosaurine. Chasmosaurine.
Who names this shit?
Paleontologists. Dinosaur nerds with lots of time on their hands. If you look up that term, if you look up Chasmosaurine and anagenesis, which is the process of having speciation without, like, splitting off into multiple branches, it's just one line of descent, then you will find papers on that, and you can see these, like, species to species to species transitions. Additionally, I know I said it earlier, you can do that with phytoplankton. That phytoplankton, like foraminifera, radiolarians, coccolithophores, all these guys have truly, like, awe-inspiring fossil records where, again, you can literally see transitions between species, because instead of, unlike us, mammals, where all of our hard parts are, either our teeth or on the inside, and most of us is meaty stuff, phytoplankton are, like, almost all hard stuff, right? They have this really tough shell, or we call it a shell, it's a test, technically is the right word, and that is what gets preserved. And there are like literally mountains of these. Like the White Cliffs of Dover are literally just mountains of phytoplankton fossils. That's why they're the White Cliffs. And you can
he means literally. It's physically, that's what they are. They're just basically a pile of shells.
You can start like at one end of the cliffs and like work your way like across and see like, okay, over here we have like this particular species of clam, and then as we move, it acquires like, you know, another little notch on it, then another little notch, then another. You can do that. There's like Chesapeakton, which is on the other side of the Atlantic, which is actually a scallop, and you can do that sort of thing. So these do exist. These like very finely graded fossil records, they do exist, but it's largely for things nobody ever wants to talk about, which is why they don't get brought up. Everyone wants to jump to Tiktaalik and Australopithecus. It's like, yeah, those are good examples, but like we have a much better fossil record for Foraminifera for the last 200 million years, you know?
Yeah, but they don't look good on posters. That's the problem.
That's true.
Foraminifera don't look good on posters.
I'm pretty sure things like PBS have a hard enough time maintaining their government funding when they aren't boring. So and make them more boring, they're going to have a hard day.
There's also among the ammonoids, there's a great fossil record that's similarly, and we're talking for hundreds of millions of years, going from the very basal ammonoids from which we get both ammonites in, you know, like the late Mesozoic and as well as modern ammonites today. But when you go on modern nautiluses today, not ammonites, those are extinct. But when you go, you can watch the sutures go from the very basic, simple sutures that nautiluses today still have, and you can watch them go to gonatidic sutures where they're a bit squiggly, and then go to ceratidic sutures where the squiggles themselves have squiggles, all the way to the ammonitic sutures with the true ammonites where the squiggles are like, they're like fractal designs. They're so ridiculously complex. And you can watch that happen smoothly as you go up through the geologic column. It's all there. Now, if you are asking for every single lineage to have this kind of transitional series like we have with many phytoplankton, like we have with nautiloids, like we have with some chasmosaurine dinosaurs, like we have with Thalassocnus, and to some extent like we have with humans, I would say that the human fossil record is about as smooth as anyone could ever hope for. But we're not going to get that for everything, for the simple reason that not everything that was preserved in the fossil record, even under the creationist assumption of a flood causing the fossil record, you still have no reason to think that every single species would have a preserved representative. So if your question is, do we have such evolutionary sequences? The answer is a resounding yes. If the question is, do we have such a sequence for every single currently living lineage? Well, then the answer is no. But I would argue that because evolution predicts that some such sequences should be found, and the fact that no creationists until they were found ever predicted that they should be found, that does count as a point in favor of evolution.
I'd have to look at the things you're talking about because I've not looked into those. So
it's fair from what I can tell.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that's totally fair, especially since a lot of what been talked about, particularly with more full structures from point A to point B, is just stuff that does not, like, it's hard to find. If you're not studying the topic, you're not really even going to know where to look. And I think part of that is just due to, you know, people like things that are exciting, and people don't think plankton is exciting unless it's on SpongeBob.
True.
Even then, is he the most exciting character?
Him and Squidward are pretty great. Or
urchins. Urchins are another thing where, you know, you have lots of very hard, these organisms have a very hard test and a very good fossil record. But again, who gives a care about Micraster from the Permian? You know, who cares, right? No one's looking at that.
I do, Jackson.
Well, I mean, you know, we do, yeah, but most people, no one cares. And that's why it's conversations with creations about transitional fossils very rarely like go here, for the simple fact that everyone's heard of Tiktaalik, because Tiktaalik is flashy, Tiktaalik is cool, and is part of, again, a rather well represented fossil sequence. You have things that are more fishy, and then you have things that are more tetrapod. So it's a good example. Certainly, it's a good sequence to use. But like in terms of things with a better sequence, yeah, we have lots of stuff with a better sequence. But it is what it is. It's just the nature of
the evolutionists are hiding it from everybody.
It's true.
Well,
Well,
they do talk. They talk about it, but they talk about it more on lines with geology and the geological column and Noah's flood and all that. And that's where it would be discussed, and that's what I say. I have to look into it.
Yeah, no,
Yes,
absolutely.
I've looked into
That's
that.
fair. And here's the thing: it's rarely do we get actually someone taking us up on this offer. But we're happy to come back and talk to people that we've talked to previously after they've gone ahead and taken a look at some of the stuff that we gave. Because look, Jackson and I can spit a ridiculous number of scientific names at you of various organisms that the average person has never even heard of and absolutely does not care about. And we get that. So if that is something that you want to look up and then come back to us after you've looked into things like Thalassocnus or Chasmosaurines or whatever, I'd be happy to do that again. But I think the takeaway should be that at least as far as most paleontologists and just biologists broadly are concerned, the question, do we have a smooth evolutionary sequence for at least some lineages, is very much a yes. And if you wanted to say that we didn't, it would be incumbent upon anyone making such a claim to go through literally every single such series and show why, for some reason,
it's a big ask.
it isn't what we say it is. Which is, and I want to be clear, what we mean by transitional species, right, is a species which contains the primitive characters that a later group retains, but has only some of the derived characteristics that later group has. So, for instance, if we were to pick, say, what's a really good one? We'll go with mammals, right? Because people are familiar with mammals. So if we want to say, I would contest that Gorgonopsids, which were really cool saber-toothed predators from the Permian, are transitional between sort of basic tetrapods and mammals. Well, I would say, okay, well, they have all of the basic tetrapod traits, right? They have the 4 limbs, they have the postanal tail, they've got the pentadactyl, which is 5-finger or 5-toe, hands and manus and pes, hand and feet. They've got all the same bones that you would expect from the basic tetrapod skull. But when they get to the mammal side, okay, well, they have some mammal things, right? Like they have the synapsid condition. They have different teeth in different positions in the jaw, like they have incisors versus canines versus premolars versus molars. But they also lack certain features that mammals have. For instance, they don't have a distinction between the thoracic vertebrae and the dorsal vertebrae. The rib cage just goes all the way down to the hip. They lack the complex inner ear that mammals have, the 3 inner ear bones. They only have 1 inner ear bone. They still have the more basic tetrapod jaw joint between the quadrate and the articular, which is close to the serrate, doesn't matter. They don't have, that dentary squamosal jaw joint that you do as a mammal, that I don't as a non-mammal. So they are intermediate because they share some of the derived characteristics that we've identified from mammals. They share all of the primitive characteristics that mammals also share with the rest of tetrapods. But they don't have all of the characteristics of mammals that we would expect of a true mammal, which is why we say that they're transitional. Now, if you want to make the statement, I don't think Gorgonopsids are ancestral to mammals, I'm going to agree with you. I don't think they are either. But that's not what we mean by transitional. So it's important to remember that when we say something is transitional, we don't need it to technically be the actual ancestor. Because for one thing, given that the fossil record is very incomplete by everyone's account, it's unlikely that we're going to find the literal actual ancestor. But because organisms tend to exist in larger populations of, multiple species of similar types, when we find the anatomy that we would expect of an ancestor, we call it transitional because the actual ancestor was probably very like that thing. And I feel like I've gone off on a tangent, and I'm sorry. I'll shut up.
Well, that kind of
Dapper.
a little bit that's a little bit deceiving for the layman, wouldn't you think?
I mean,
No,
I don't know.
think so at all.
So if someone says that this galaxy is 9 billion light years away, then what they actually mean is that it has a particular redshift, which at that distance is actually how we measure astronomical distances, because it becomes very hard to define actual distances when you take into account things like inflation and relativity. I don't think that's deceiving because most people don't want to hear a redshift value because it doesn't mean anything to them. Similarly, I don't think that using a shorthand for transitional and saying this is, this group is ancestral to this later group, that is actually probably true. And And so, yeah, it's one of those things where, like, look, most people are never going to get to the point in their lives where they know enough about evolutionary biology that they can just fluidly read evolutionary biology papers without having to look things up and be confused and ask for help. In fact, most evolutionary biologists don't quite make it there. Most of them still have trouble reading other papers in evolutionary biology. It's a very complicated field. And I don't think the fact that people don't understand it is on its own going to be deceptive. For instance, if you're curious about it, you can find out.
To be fair, I think he's got a little bit of a point in that it is difficult when it comes to science communication. Right, scientific communication is from a field to a layman is something that's very, very hard, and certainly the jargon and the obnoxious names that things get called makes it very difficult. And like, why? Is there a reason? Is there like a reason for that besides just kind of fucking with people a little bit?
I mean, no. So the point of terminology, and I make this point in a video we're gonna put out shortly because
Jackson chilling away.
I got very mad at the word ambulacrarian because it's stupid. The word ambulacrarian means possessing ambulacral grooves, and it refers to hemichordates who don't have ambulacral grooves and echinoderms who do. So why would you call the total group ambulacraria? That's stupid. But anyway, so the point of terminology, of scientific terminology, is to be precise and accurate, right? You want to mean what you say. You want to have a very particular. What?
Sorry, it's among people who work in that field or are knowledgeable in that field.
Among people who work in that field, when you say a thing, you want to mean one particular thing. You don't want to say, and that's kind of the issue we take with like kinds of information, right? These terms, we're not sure what they mean, and every time we've interacted with people who claim to have a definition of them, we're left with more questions about what they mean. Like if you say,
I still don't know what you mean by either of them.
The point I'm trying to make is, these terms need to have specific meanings. Now, obviously, they're like, in a sense, they're arbitrary, right? Like a term can mean anything, but we want to have a term that's useful. It refers to something that exists in the real world that we can point to and say, this is this. And so with terms like transitional, I think in the literature, like, I don't think saying that an organism that possesses characteristics, some characteristics that are ancestral and some characteristics that are derived, I don't think there's anything deceptive about that. I think it can be difficult to explain to people that, no, this thing isn't your ancestor. It has characteristics of what your ancestor would have had. And maybe that adds an extra layer to understanding, but I don't think that's deceptive, if that makes sense. I think that,
if I can clarify this a little bit, is that there is a specific jargon in a field of science, the same way you have a specific jargon in a field of like electricians. They'll use words and terms that don't really make sense to anybody outside of that field. So like if I were to say a fob, you're going to think about X, Y, and Z in X, Y, and Z field, depending on who I'm talking to. If I use the word theory, it's going to mean a different thing if I'm talking about a theory about a game, or I'm talking about a game theory, or if I'm talking about a theory amongst biology, or if I'm talking about a theory in music. These are all different terms.
Sure, but again, I don't think that's deceptive. I think that's
I don't think it's deceptive, but I think it's a fair.
Okay, well, that's the word that was used previously.
I think it's a fair complaint.
Well, because most people think of transitional fossils, they are thinking of a direct ancestor leading up to what you see now, or leading up to what you see in the fossil record. So you have T-Rex. Okay, where's the transitional fossils leading up to T-Rex? And so where are the transitions? So
the answer to that is like Alioramus.
But similar. Okay, but having that's different. That's vastly different than saying they have characteristics, similar characteristics.
Well, you have to have those characteristics to be labeled as a transitional, right? To be even considered as ancestral to something else, you have to have the characteristics that we're describing, right? You have to have some characteristics that are ancestral and some characteristics that are derived. Otherwise, how would you define it? How would you measure it? Also, so it has to have those characteristics.
If the complaint is evolutionary biologists are not doing a terrific job of explaining their science to the general public, I will not disagree with you there. There is definitely a sense in which evolutionary biologists tend to fail to adequately explain their ideas to the public. So if you want to say, I don't think it's an intentional deceit. I do think it is a failing on the part of evolutionary biologists. And if you want to say that I think evolutionary biologists should do a better job of explaining what they mean, I am with you 100%. Because I know some evolutionary biologists, and when I sometimes see them explain things to people who aren't evolutionary biologists, I'm like, come on, man. There's no way that you're getting across the meaning that you're trying to, because you're using terms
Like when people say plesiomorphy, who
with.
does that?
Yeah, no, exactly. Anyone
who
who
would
just
do
starts
that?
out
Not me,
talking
that's
about
for sure.
plesiomorphy with the general public without defining it, that person should probably be pilloried.
Exactly. Wait, hold on a second. What?
I think I have a question from the chat that I think falls aligned with a little bit what Daniel's been saying so far, and it's mostly a complaint or a criticism, but I'm gonna try to phrase it as a question so that maybe we can get a proper answer. With the example of goats that you had provided, Jackson, how do you delineate when the goat has changed from a goat to something else, either backwards or forwards in time?
Oh, I mean, it's morphological characters, right? You look at, like, for instance, one of the characteristics is the eyes. The position of the eyes in Myotragus, which is the example I was using, they start out here, like goats or artiodactyls have, and then they move forward. And you could actually look at the changes in the skull, so you can see the movement of the orbits from more towards the side to more in the center. That's how you
between
determine.
point A and point B, when is it not a goat anymore?
It's always a goat. And that's what we were saying earlier with evolution says you can never leave your ancestry, right? If you're a goat, you're always going to be a goat. You're always going to be a mammal, a tetrapod, a eukaryote, blah, blah, blah.
So the way this works is you can diverge within groups that have already been established, but you cannot leave previous groups. So an analogy I would say is like, imagine an append-only file, right? So let's say you have a text file, right? So it's only append, which means you can only add new entries at the end of the file. Okay. And so you send this append-only text file to the four of us, right? So Chesh gets a copy, Jackson gets a copy, Daniel gets a copy, and I get a copy. And each of us get to randomly enter any one character at the end of this append-only file, right? And then each of us send it to, say, 2 people. And they get to randomly append a character. At no point in this process, no matter how long it goes on, are the original characters from earlier on in the chain going to go away because it's append only, right? You physically can't alter that file that way because it's append only. That's kind of how evolution works, right? You can append new groups onto the older groups that have already existed, but no group is ever going to be able to leave those old groups. So, for instance, if humans are primates, then even if, and we'll just assume evolution is true, and we'll assume that, like, you know, Mr. Musk's fever dream of Mars is true. Even if humans go to Mars, become a new Martian species of human, they'll still be primates. And even if those Martian humans then go on to colonize Alpha Centauri Prime 3 or whatever, I don't know, and evolve into yet another species, they'll still be primates. And eventually, even if they go on to colonize some ocean world and fully adapt to being completely aquatic, and they develop, you know, echolocation like a dolphin, and they have flippers instead of hands and feet, and they get a blowhole, they'll still be primates. Because you don't get to change the previous entries in your taxonomy. Those have to stay. But you can get new entries into the taxonomy. You can become a particular kind of primate, a particular type of primate. That's why not all primates are the same. That's why baboons aren't the same as humans, aren't the same as marikis, which is a South American monkey, doesn't matter. So yeah, evolution only ever appends new entries into the clades or the taxonomy. It never erases the old entries. So a goat will always produce goats.
And that's what I'm saying. That has to be proven. There has to be some kind of observable science, not looking at fossils, not looking at we have these and these and these are similar. You have to be able to look at the genome itself and the cells and all of that and see, hey, there's a mechanism in here that will do that.
It's mutation and selection and drift.
What we were talking about, so with mutations, like if you like, let's say we just decide to go and, like, you know, look at the whole chimpanzee genome, we like throw it up on the screen, you know, for all of us to see. and then we also throw up the human genome right next to it. We
Mhm.
compare them. The only differences that are going to exist between them are mutational differences. Like, that's it. It's going to be like insertions, deletions, point mutations. It's going to be.
Are you talking about? Wait.
like-
Are you talking about the human? You're talking about the human genome there? Or
Yeah, if you compare like the human
all
genome, I'm saying between between all genomes really. If you compare like the human and chimp, for instance, just these two genomes, just the two of them,
Mm-hmm.
the differences between them are going to be like point mutations, insertions, deletions, probably a couple retroviruses, some transpositions, some inversions. But like, that's it. It's all going to be changes to the actual sequences of nucleotides. That's the difference between us and chimps, between chimps and bonobos, which are the sister group to chimps. It's going to be the difference between us and gorillas, orangutans, blue whales, elephants, pine trees. Whatever we're looking at, the difference between the genomes of any two things are going to be the actual sequence of nucleotides. And like, that's it. That's the difference. So the mechanism is mutation.
The mechanism. I can't see anywhere where anybody says that's just a proven science there.
I mean, it is. Like, if you compare literally any two organisms on the planet, the only difference is, like, once you get, like, where do our bodies come from? They come from our genome, right? They are constructions of our genome, and that's it. Like, nothing else.
I understand that. I understand that's standard evolutionary theory there, but as far as observable science, there's plenty of people that just like totally would disagree. PhDs in biology would totally disagree with that.
I mean, they're welcome to disagree with that, but like, for instance, you've probably heard of the Richard Lenski E. coli experiment, for instance, right? Like, this long-term experiment with bacteria, that's Escherichia coli, and it underwent a variety of mutations. It has to date not stopped fitness gains. Like, it's still gaining in fitness. It has continually accrued more and more and more beneficial mutations. So mutations that arise in an individual and then spread through selection to the rest of the population. One of the more famous examples, aside from like size increase and I think a reproductive, like they increase the rate at which they reproduce, is one of them, something like that. One of the more famous ones was a population which was developed the ability to metabolize citrate under aerobic conditions, so in the presence of oxygen. One of the defining characteristics of Escherichia coli is the inability to do that, is the inability to metabolize citrate when oxygen is present. That's like definitionally one of the things that makes E. coli. And so the argument was made when this occurred that this should be a new species. I think it's irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is, it gained this ability by a partial gene, there was a couple genes that it duplicated. It duplicated them and then put them like next to each other, so that a duplicate was placed under the control of a promoter, which is a region that basically says, hey, RNA polymerase, I need to be made into RNA so I can become a protein. I can be translated into a protein. Whereas that couldn't happen before. And so that is a novel characteristic that occurred as a result of a mutational difference, right?
And there's still bacteria, though.
Okay, but that was never the issue. We keep coming back to this, but
evolution is a pendulum.
Yes, you can never leave your ancestry. The bacteria will never, under evolution, it will never, ever, never, ever not be bacteria. Never, ever. That will never not be.
Yeah. If it happens, that will be a gigantic blow to evolution. It might not be a boon to young Earth creationism in particular, but it would be a gigantic blow. Because remember, evolution is append only. If it starts as a bacteria, it never gets to erase that bacteria entry. It gets to add new entries at the end, but it can't erase the old entry. Append only evolution.
Yeah.
So if the complaint is ever this group, we're still this group.
But
you misunderstood evolution.
Go ahead, Dan.
I'm misunderstanding what you guys are calling evolution. I don't know that I'm misunderstanding what is taught in every high school on the planet, that everything evolved from a common ancestor.
Uh-huh.
Yes, that is consistent with append only.
So Okay,
are
so
we
you share a
are we
common
getting
ancestor.
into the are you a eukaryote questioning?
Actually, I was actually about to address that.
Yeah.
So, for
Okay,
instance,
that's
you share a common ancestor with. I'll use Ken Hoven's favorite example, a pine tree. You share a common ancestor with a pine tree because you both have a number of like core eukaryotic genes for like how to deal with your genome and like your cells and stuff. But aside from that, one of the primary characteristics in common we have with pine trees is all of our or most of our cells are nucleated. That's not even technically true, but whatever. We're just going to go with that. Your cells are nucleated. Most of your cells have a nucleus, and that is what holds your nuclear DNA. They also pretty much all have mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell. And that is a characteristic you share with all other eukaryotes. So us and pine trees are both eukaryotes. Now we have gone
Jackson,
down.
But that doesn't prove a common ancestor.
I have to
just
accuse
as easily
Jackson.
proves a
You're
creator.
kind of going between different points. You're kind of like switching back and forth between different arguments here. On the one hand, it seems you're
Jackson,
saying yes.
real quick, that was myxozoan erasure, and I don't appreciate it.
I know, and technically, like your 80% blood cell or red blood cells, which don't have a nucleus or mitochondria at all. So, or no, they do have mitochondria. I think they don't have a nucleus. Whatever. Anyway,
I'm just being a dick, man. Just don't worry about it.
But which is why I was like, well, it's you have most of your cells have a nucleus. Well, no, like 80% of them don't, but whatever. But so
What's your cell
you're kind of
types?
switching between. Yeah, it seems like you're kind of switching between two arguments here, Daniel, because the argument you gave first was that a version of evolution is being taught in which organisms are leaving their ancestry, right? And we said, no one's learning that. That's not how evolution works. And I know it's not being taught in the high school because I looked at the high school standards recently. So no, that's not being taught. We are in a group. You are in part of progressively like larger groups, right? It's like a Matryoshka doll. So you have groups within larger groups, within larger groups, within larger groups.
I understand how the theory is changing, but that leaves us back to
that's been true since Linnaeus.
Abiogenesis, and you literally have
that's
to
a totally
have,
separate conversation.
So you always say that, but you literally have to have at some point have these super creations that everything branched off of, and you just that's where.
At least for the purposes
you have to have these
alpha
creatures. You have to have alpha creatures that everything branched off of. That has all of it. That has. I mean, I don't understand how you don't see that.
Would an alpha creature
that's
be?
not how evolution works.
Just out of curiosity, would a theoretical alpha creature be a two-celled organism?
I would expect one.
Sure. Would
Let
an
me
alpha creature
propose
be a
something.
one-celled organism? Is that what an alpha would
I mean,
look like?
where do we go from one cell to millions? I mean, how is
pregnancy?
and then back down again? Because that's what you're saying. We started here with nothing. We went up here, and now we're going back down again. I don't see.
Let me propose a stipulation, and I think Jackson will agree to it.
Okay.
Sure. I will stipulate that I am perfectly okay, at least for this conversation, saying that the common ancestor of all modern life was in fact directly, miraculously created by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael, who exists as the triune God of Christianity, with God the Father as the first person of the Trinity, God Jesus Christ as the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. I will accept that is the God described in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, as well as the Apostles' Creed. I will stipulate all of that is true as regards to the creation of the first life on which evolution then acted. So that way we can just say, hey, if you have questions about the origin of life, I do too. If you want to say that's what God did, I don't want to dispute it with you. I'm happy for you to say that that's what happened. Jackson, would you be okay with that stipulation for the purposes of this conversation? All right. Daniel, would you be okay with accepting that is our for this conversation, stipulated acceptable position.
Except that I'm not a theistic evolutionist, so.
Okay.
So,
but would you be willing to say that at least we don't have to fight about the first life, because Jackson and I are willing to say maybe it was the Christian God who did all of it, and we're not going to object to that as a possibility, for at least for the purposes of this discussion.
Well, I still don't see how it could be okay, but I still don't see how that leads us from one-cell creatures, bacteria, all the way up to, I don't know, the super-duper T-Rex, who then we all these other branches off of.
That's a variety of different conversations.
Well, do we have experiments in which researchers have induced multicellularity from unicellular ancestors?
We sure do.
Maybe more than one.
There's one with Matt Herron from 2019. There's another one, or a series of them with Will Ratcliffe et al. And Geos and Bosdag in the Ratcliffe lab.
What do you mean by induced, though? Exactly, precisely.
So basically, what they do is they have a mutation. They develop a mutation or a series of mutations under a certain set of selective pressures, and this causes them, instead of when they split from, so like they do mitosis or binary fission, instead of splitting after they do that, they stay stuck together. So it's not one now, it's a two-celled organism, or 3 or 4, however many. And then they retain that characteristic indefinitely. It turns out, even in the presence, even when you return them to flasks that have the ancestor in it, the unicellular ancestor, those now multicellular ancestors do not get out-competed by their unicellular ancestors.
So what experiment was that?
If you look up William, so William Ratcliffe, Ratcliff, he did, his work is with, if you look up snowflake yeast, which is the phenotype for his early work with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is your common beer and bread yeast.
The best fungus. It is the best fungus. So I hear no arguments.
So basically, what he did was he took this yeast and he
applied
it to.
I can look that up.
So, okay, sure. Well, so broadly, basically, what happened was he subjected it to a selection pressure in which being able to settle faster in a flask was better than not being able to do that. And so they developed multicellularity as a result. And actually, he's continued his work. And not only are they now not just multicellular, because even when they were multicellular, they were still microscopic. Like a snowflake yeast is like a few dozen cells. You can't see that. That's too small. But now they are thousands and thousands of cells. And they're actually like over a millimeter in diameter. They form these big clusters. They're super cool. I've had
visible to the naked eye if you look closely.
Yeah, they are literally visible to the naked eye.
I also want to point out that we know also of instances in which multicellular organisms have created unicellular organisms. So, for instance, there is a transmissible venereal tumor among canines. It's called canine transmissible venereal tumor, or some combination of those words. And it is, in fact, a unicellular species of parasitic dog. There is a unicellular parasitic dog species that exists.
Or the HeLa cells.
Or the HeLa cells, which are parasite. Well, they're not. Well, sometimes they're parasitic, but they're largely independently living human cells. There is now another species of human that is an independently living unicellular organism. It's also true for Tasmanian devils. There are now unicellular Tasmanian devils that are parasitizing their ancestral population of Tasmanian devils. Basically, we have going from unicellular to multicellular already observed. We have going from multicellular to unicellular observed. We have bicellular organisms. I was going to say Diplodocus, but that's wrong. It's Diplococcus, which
Gonium
is a bacterium.
pectorale. Gonium pectorale is an algae. They actually span, they go from not just 2 to all the way up to 32 cells, depending.
Yeah, so we have 2-cell organisms. We have all the stages between that going up into the hundreds of cells. We have organisms which are colonial. We have organisms which are truly multicellular, which means they have different cell types. So, for instance, the most basic cell type differentiation that you get the earliest on is the difference between somatic cells and reproductive cells. So the reproductive cells are involved in making new instances of this species, right? And the somatic cells are the ones that actually do the hard work of being an organism, like gathering nutrients, doing most of the metabolism, creating sugars, whatnot. We have organisms with different cell types, but not quite tissues yet, like sea sponges. Sea sponges have differentiated cell types, but they don't have tissues or organs. We have organisms with basic tissue types, like we get in some of the more basally derived plants. We have things with full-on organ systems, like we have with most radial animals, like sea jellies and corals and stuff like that. We have all of this, and we have.
I've read about some of that. I've read about some transfer, where the cross horizontal transfer and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think that I really don't think creationists have issues with any of that. And that's just, but it just doesn't explain. Number one, I'm young Earth, so that's one issue with me, and it just doesn't explain what we actually see out there.
So when I mentioned the yeast experiment, like that was a human timescale experiment in which we know they do know precisely what genetic changes occurred, and we know what the phenotype that resulted was. We had a unicellular organism who became multicellular, right? Like, I don't know what more we could want from that.
I have
because it's not turning. It's still yeast.
It will always be yeast. Forever until the end of time, it will be a yeast.
We're back to append only. Every time you say it's still X, you have misunderstood what evolution is about. Every time you say it is a mistake about what evolution is. But also, I have a quick question.
It's a mistake of a definition that's not understood by the general public, is what it is. You're putting a specific scientific evolution is only this. When the public understands is evolution is we all have a common ancestor and we all came down from that common everything that
those are equally
came
true
from that common ancestor.
Yeah,
those are the same thing.
True.
They're equally true, but you can't we can't have these. I see these discussions on X where it's just like big arguments over definitions, and it's just like, to me it's just like, what are we even talking about here? I want to keep it simple, so people understand what I'm saying.
With the example I gave with the yeast, with the yeast, for instance, if I may try, there is, in a sense, like a new clade that has appeared, right? The new clade is the multicellular yeast, right? So there was a point when there were no multicellular yeast, and now there are multicellular yeast, right? But the ancestors of the multicellular yeast were themselves unicellular, right?
Right.
Okay, so we have a point where we have a new clade, multicellular yeast, but multicellular yeast is not separate from, they did not lose their unicellular ancestry, right? All their ancestors were unicellular. So even though their ancestors are no longer, even though they themselves are no longer unicellular, their ancestors still will always have been yeast. So the multicellular yeast will still always be yeast, even though it's just a new clade now. It is multicellular yeast. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't see any issues with that.
Okay, so what I'm saying, so when you say, for instance, they're still yeast, we're agreeing because that's a bit like saying, well, the multicellular yeast didn't come from yeast before, right? Which doesn't make any sense. There's no point at which the multicellular yeast were not yeast, or that they won't be yeast in the future. They will still always be yeast, and they came from yeast. So they themselves are still in this category. Likewise, and I want to take this analogy because it's the same thing, right? It's not even really an analogy. It's just a comparison. Humans, we have characteristics that differentiate us from all other mammals. We can make computers, and tools better than pretty much every other species. We are bipedal in our own particular way, unlike any other mammal species on the planet, right? We have these characteristics that set us apart, make us unique. But we still have a set of characteristics that make us apes. We will never, those characteristics are part of us, like our particular molar pattern, the shapes of our different bones, our skull. So even though we're humans, we're a small circle, we are part of a bigger circle that is apes. So likewise with the yeast, multicellular yeast is the small circle. Yeast in general is the bigger circle. You follow me? See what I'm saying?
It's a huge leap. That's a huge leap.
No, there's no leap. There's no leap involved. It's
leap.
literally the same.
There is a huge
It's
leap.
literally the same thing.
Yeah.
You agree that
Well,
multicellular yeast...
Can we ask?
You agree
Daniel,
that multicellular yeast...
Could we
Go
maybe ask what's the leap that Jackson's making?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because of the complexity of the organisms.
Okay, well now we have a new term. How do you know what organism is complex? How complex it is? Because that's the thing is, creationists love to use terms that do not occur in biology normally, right? At least not as technical terms. And I don't know what they mean by them. And then when I ask them, I very rarely come away feeling like I do now understand.
I didn't give you a scientific definition there. I'm just saying you're talking the creation of a whole boatload of different information that does that's not creating. Well, it's not creating apes. We're not creating apes. It's just it. And you also have to have a fossil record back to that, which you don't have. I know you say you do, but that's not what I've seen. Yeah, big time evolutionary paleontologists say we don't. So just reading it yesterday.
No, they don't say that. That's ridiculous.
1918. They're just going, man, this is a big mess. Nobody has it. Nobody's agreeing on it. Nobody. It's just like we don't have anything.
Daniel, I would love if you maybe you can't, and that's fine. Maybe you can send it to me later. But I would love to know the name of a evolutionary biologist who is actually a published evolutionary biologist in the actual literature, who works on humans, so a paleoanthropologist, who thinks that the fossil record of hominins does not support the ancestry of humans from Miocene apes. If you could name one of those, and like I said, you probably can't right now because it's a big ask. There's a lot of names out there. There's a lot of papers. But if you could name one and get back to me, because my understanding from both my own reading in paleoanthropology as well as speaking to paleoanthropologists is that there is absolutely no discussion about the idea that the fossil record does not conclusively connect humans to other extant apes from a Miocene ape ancestor. That is my understanding of the current state of paleoanthropology. Maybe
I should have copied it. I should have copied what I read. Geez, just like 2 or 3 days ago about that.
Look, that's why I'm like, look, you can get.
That's always the case.
You can get it to me later. Yeah,
and also, it happens to me all the time.
I have to go find it. I don't even know what I was reading.
No, that's fair. That's very fair. But I will say this: if you're going to draw from Contested Bones by John Sanford and what's Roop's first name? I don't remember. Christopher.
No, it wasn't
Christopher. Okay, because I was going to say,
anything like that.
Basically, all of the paleoanthropologists whose work they cited disagree strongly with the conclusions of their book. So I would just point that out. So the thing is, what we do get is paleoanthropologists who will argue about the exact place of various fossil taxa within the picture of human evolution. Right? They'll say, okay, I think that Australopithecus afarensis is not as close to the direct lineage of Homo sapiens as Australopithecus africanus or Australopithecus sediba, right? They'll say that. And then someone else will come and say, oh no, I actually think that Australopithecus afarensis is closer to Homo sapiens and that Australopithecus africanus is maybe closer to Australopithecus boisei, right? So they'll argue about the exact shape of this family tree that they're drawing, right? But I've never heard a single.
They argue about a whole lot more than that. Right. With all of it, a lot more stuff than that.
Well, they do argue about a lot of other stuff, but I've never heard one of them argue that the evidence for human evolution that the identity of humans as apes, or that their evolution from Miocene apes, or that their common ancestry with things like
they
chimpanzees
may
and
not
bonobos.
they may not argue about and say they're not going to say, well, this just disproves evolution because they'll lose their funding. But they argue amongst
that's just
themselves something
conspiracy theory.
terrible
Maybe-
about that stuff.
Maybe
That's not
an
conspiracy
analogy might help.
theory.
Maybe an
No?
analogy might help, right?
Well,
so, like,
Go
hold on. Let me finish the analogy, right? So what it feels like is happening, right, is if, say, me and Chesh were having a discussion about whether or not pineapple belongs on pizza, right? And I'm going to take the no position, and I'm just going to decide that Chesh is taking the yes position, right?
Of course you are.
But then someone comes and says, okay, but have you considered that pudding can't lead to pizza no matter how long you cook it? To which I go, I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You're not entering this conversation. There's nothing to do with this conversation. You're like, I have no recognition of what you're talking about. And that's what this kind of feels like, because paleoanthropologists, like all active fields of science, there are many debates. You will never find an active field of research that does not have debates in it. But pointing out that there are debates in a field of science does not negate the universal consensus on other topics within that science. So, for instance, there are debates about how quantum gravity works. You're never going to find someone who says, well, okay, you're never going to find a physicist who's going to tell you that gravity
There's debates on if there's a universal consensus over what you're talking about within the fields. And so that's the issue. You can't just say there's not. I mean,
You can, if you look at like any of the surveys that have been done, there have been numerous surveys on this over decades now. Like it's not even brought up. Like there are no technical papers that come out that are like seriously challenging the idea that evolution is like the reigning paradigm in biology. It just is, and like it has been for 150 years now. Like no one's challenging that.
I have a question for our panelists, particularly about semantics, because I think we were getting a little bit into definitions and technical definitions and non-technical definitions and bridging that gap between those things, but specifically about defining an ape. Because I'm seeing it a little bit in chat as well of people saying, well, science just defines an ape to be something that is convenient for evolution. Could you maybe expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. Well, so in one sense, all taxonomic categories are arbitrary, right? This is what I was saying earlier with the ambulacrarian. Just forget it; doesn't matter. But all taxonomic categories are arbitrary to an extent. So when we are making up names for categories, or like coming up with like lists of characters for categories, we want to make it as useful as possible, right? Because if something is arbitrary, you might as well make it useful. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it? You're just going to make it harder on yourself. So, ape it refers to hominoidea, which is the superfamily, right?
Yeah, it's a superfamily. It's Hylobatidae and Hominidae.
Yeah, so Hominidae, which is orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans, and Hylobatidae, which is gibbons and siamangs and all those guys. Those two are united together as hominoid. Yeah, the lesser apes. Even though I think they're cooler than us, but whatever.
Look, it just means that they're smaller. That's literally all it means.
Yeah. So being an ape is literally just defined by a set of like morphological characteristics, like having nails on the ends of your fingers, having a Y5 molar pattern, having like your eyes that point forward, not having a tail. It's just a set of morphological characteristics that define that we share with chimps, gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons. Right? That's what ape means. It refers to that.
Yeah.
And then if you get a bit broader, you go ahead.
So one thing I want to point out is with the arbitrariness, right? So taxa are labels that humans put on groups of organisms, right? Clades are objectively existing groups of organisms that share common ancestry. And that's true even under young earth creationism, right? Because young earth creationism will accept that, say, your pet dog and a wolf share a common ancestor. And a more recent common ancestor than your pet wolf would share with, say, a Japanese tanuki, which is a adorable little canine. Go look it up if you have free time. They're great. So like most creationists would agree with that, right?
Kind of like pandas and trash pandas.
Well, yeah, they're like the Japanese answer to the raccoon, kind of.
Yeah, raccoons,
They're even called raccoon dogs in some cases. So anyway, even under young Earth creationism, at least most versions I've ever heard of, clades exist. Scientists would like their taxa to map to clades where possible. But exactly where we put a label is fundamentally going to be arbitrary. So for instance, if the history of cladistics had come out differently, and we didn't use the word ape to refer to all of hominoidea, but only the great apes, well, okay, that's a difference of how we use the word. But the clades themselves either do or don't exist, right? So if all hylobatids and hominids share a common ancestor, then that's a clade. Whether you call it ape or you call it dinglehop, it doesn't actually matter to the science and to the objective reality of what's going on. So yeah, is ape an arbitrary category? Yes. Are the clades involved arbitrary? No, they either objectively exist or they don't. And the question of science, which is ultimately the question of this debate, is do they actually exist? I would say yes. Jackson would say yes. I believe, Daniel, you would reject common ancestry for all apes, including humans, right?
Pretty much. But I have to take a quick break here, guys. Excuse me?
Oh, okay. Hey, we could take an intermission. I'm not having fun. I don't know. Chesh, you're muted.
Chesh, you're
We
muted.
can take a quick intermission, but we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Oh, that's true.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
I'm okay with going a little extra if people want to.
You guys are gonna do this to me?
No,
It's your show,
I'm
Chesh.
okay with
Do
it.
whatever
If
you-
people are okay with. Yeah, you can shut it down at any point.
So
You have
I think
the complete power.
I think
Well,
I think we
I
should take the
also was-
opportunity. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna go, but I was just gonna wait because I also figured it would only be 2 hours.
Yeah. I think it might be a good idea is while he's gone, chill your shit, and then when we go, we can let him
Yeah.
chill his shit, and we can actually get out of here on time.
Jackson, what are you doing tomorrow?
What are you doing tomorrow?
Oh, I'll probably go to work, do my normal work stuff.
What are you doing after that? Like around 8 p.m.
8:01 p.m.
I guess there's some guy, there's some theropod. You see, I'll be hanging out with him for a little bit. We're talking about this silly guy who like shares a name in common with me. So
Is it like maybe called Jackson with Jackson on the Dapper Dinosaur channel?
that's what it is. Yeah. Exactly. That's your channel.
Yeah, so,
It'll be on your
my
channel. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
so hey, head over to my channel
I'm glad I
and
passed
you
that
can
one.
see Jackson with Jackson on the 26th. Oh, and Daniel's back.
Links are in the description
thank
down
you.
below. Please continue. We are getting close to wrapping up as well, so if we do want to schedule another one of these and continue on with the discussion and go kind of further down this rabbit hole, as we're starting to get into things like abiogenesis and things like very, very niche like planktons. I'm more than happy. It will give Daniel some time to look up some of the stuff that he wanted to bring to the table as well. We can definitely look to do that, but finish your couple of points and we're going to start wrapping up.
Well, what you were saying right before I left, that you can sit there, you can create it's a theory. You could create a theory. We'll just call it a theory, even though I don't really believe evolution is a theory anymore. But you can create it and put all of these names on the call. This is a clad, and we absolutely have a common ancestor. That has to be proven. I mean, I know that's what you believe it is, and I know you believe it's proven, but there's a whole lot of people who don't believe that. And we have reasons for it. And we're not just looking at the Bible for those reasons. We're looking at science and going, there's something it's not going to fit that. And that science is that for an animal, and we'll just say with the same clad, okay? For a chimp or an ape or a common ancestor of either of chimps and apes and people, that's just not, it's not evolutionarily possible. First off, you don't have the time for it. If time was even a factor in the matter, which I don't believe it is, but you also don't have the genetic, what would be, because what you're literally having is a growth of genetic information. Because see what you're talking about, you're saying, well, it's handed down and then there's mutations and that, but that's is a lot more complex than that. A whole lot more complex. And you guys there?
Sort of. kind of not really. I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean. Like, there are other forces involved. Like, there's, natural selection, sexual selection. So, yeah, it's not just mutations happen and
So,
new organisms. It's like those variations occur in populations. Natural or sexual selection acts on them, and genetic drift and gene flow. And these, cause those variations to change in their frequencies throughout generations. And then that can ultimately result in a new species. I mean, we've directly observed.
with emphasis on the concise part.
I am not convinced that either of you could answer something concisely, so...
You know what, Chesh? I can't disagree with you.
You're welcome to try.
But Daniel, do you have questions you could direct it at either of us or both of us? Like, what do you want to know? Because we asked you so many questions, and I feel like it's a little unfair.
No, I would like to see the genetic mechanism where you're going to have a common ancestor of apes and humans and chimpanzees, and how that's going to work. Because I don't see that. That's just not out there as literature. There's a little bit here and there, like I was reading about horizontal gene transfer from certain type of plants that a parasite infected another plant with and created ferns with. But I don't see any kind of literature like that with human beings.
Yeah, I call that bogus. I don't think that's...
Well, hold on. Maybe I can phrase that into a question. So could the question be, what is the genetic mechanism that allows organisms to differentiate and have different morphologies going forard?
Drastically change. Okay. Not just environmental changes like my beak is a little bit bigger and blah blah blah.
Well, I would have a twofold answer to that. One is that all of the drastic change is ultimately an accumulation of what you're calling environmental change, right? So with a combination of also there's drift, which is actually very, very important to evolution, which is the changes that occur not because of selection or environmental pressures, but just because mating has random aspects to it. So exactly which genes get passed on and which alleles get passed on has random aspects. So accepting that, because I don't think I've ever seen anyone disagree with the idea that there's non-deterministic parts of mating and inheritance. But that, yeah, first of all, the drastic differences in morphology are a combination of just lots and lots and lots of these environmental changes, which I'll accept that terminology. And then two, its mutation is the origin for this diversity that is then acted on by selection and drift. And that those are the mechanisms that are put forth by evolutionary biologists. Now, I'm not asking you to accept them right now. That's not what I'm asking. I'm just saying the answer to the question, as would be given to you by evolutionary biologists or people who are well-versed in that field, would be that it's an accumulation over time of mutations that accumulate as a result of drift and selection, whether it be natural selection, sexual selection, or artificial selection. And like I said, I'm not expecting you to accept that, but that is the answer that evolutionary biology has for you.
Jackson, can you answer the question more concisely than Dapper did?
What was
that was pretty concise.
I do not remember what it was.
That was pretty concise.
I mean, I think his answer was... I mean, it sounded fine to me. I really wanted to give you, Daniel, I wanted to give you homework instead of like...
You can tell Jackson's been working at a school for too long.
I want to give you homework, Daniel. And this is quite simply, I want you to take two organisms for which there exists genetic data on both that you accept as sharing a common ancestor, and then compare that with two organisms you don't accept as sharing common ancestry, like, for instance, humans and chimps. If you could look at, like, the genetics of humans and chimps and read about what actual genetic differences separate us, and I want you to pick out what specific genetic events occurred, in our line that would have been impossible, that you think, right? Like, what do you think could occur between two organisms you accept as related, but not between two organisms you don't accept as related? Does that make sense?
I can probably phrase it. I can probably phrase it easier.
I understand what this means.
Oh, okay.
That sounds like an awful big homework assignment there.
I barely understand what it means.
That sounds like an awful big homework assignment there.
Well, because that's ultimately that's what gets at the heart of the information issue, right?
Yeah. Well, I could accept that a dingo is of the same, perhaps is the same genetic, but that would have to be looked at through his genetic front. But can a dingo mate with a typical a German Shepherd? Probably not.
Yes. No, it absolutely can.
Dingo can. Yeah, they're just both dogs. Yeah.
Yeah,
both
dingoes are specifically domesticated dogs. They're feral in that they now are living wild, but when you look at the genetics, they are domesticated dogs. They're much more closely related to a German Shepherd than they are a wolf.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get back into an argument.
Then.
Oh, absolutely.
Or a wild dog in Africa. Can those mate with domestic dogs?
No. Like Lycaon pictus, which is the African painted dog or a wild dog, cannot mate with Canis genuses, or at least I am unaware of any reported instances of a hybrid Lycaon Canis organism. If you find one, that'll be interesting. For instance, there was recently a Pampas fox that mated with a genus Canis to make a Pampas fox / Canis. But then again, the Pampas fox is much more closely related to dogs, like domesticated dogs and wolves, than either of them are to the painted dog of Africa. So that was actually not super unexpected. It was previously unreported, but
Well, that would be my basic answer there. But when you're talking about drastic differences, like between anything that changes that drastic, where it's like that's not even a dog, and you know what I'm saying?
Well, again, that's never a thing that evolution will accept.
Okay, but humans and chimps do not have drastic differences between us, right? Like, it's all relative changes. Every difference between us and chimps is just a relative change.
I think we might need to know what a drastic... Can you give us an example of what a drastic
you would have change? You have to define what a drastic change is, but...
Yeah.
I think
your
that's
brain,
okay.
We have, the difference between our skull and a chimp skull is literally just, our brain is bigger, our skull, is ballooned more, and our face is less prognathic. Those are the primary differences between our skull and that of chimps. I don't think that's a big difference, or that's a drastic difference. There's nothing new there. There are no bones that we have that chimps don't, or organs we have that chimps don't, or vice versa. We have all the same organs and bones. And so...
Baculum erasure.
Okay, except for but the thing with the baculum is, they also have a highly reduced baculum.
Concise!
So we've just... Yeah, anyway, the point of my question is simply, is to try to figure out, quantifiable, genetics a genetic change that could not have happened from our common ancestor. So some kind of change from our common ancestor that couldn't have happened, right?
Let me ask you this. Can they look at the genetics of a chimp and a man and trace it back?
Yes.
To say a common ancestor.
Yes, they absolutely can.
Yeah, I mean, we
share
fairly trivial. We share 90,
very doubtful of that.
That's okay.
So just to wrap it up here, I've got one last question from the chat for Daniel, and I'm gonna need. It's a 2-part question, so just a yes or no on the first part, and then maybe an extrapolation for the second part, just for the sake of brevity. Is there a logical contradiction between the existence of God and evolution being true? You think? It's a little off topic, I know.
Yeah, that's not a yes or no question, because there's a lot of different factors in that.
Well, that's the extrapolation part. Do you personally believe that there's a logical contradiction?
If you're looking straight at the science, I would say, there's no answer. No, I can't answer that.
Yeah, no problem. Maybe that can be a question for another day.
Too many variables in that to be able to just answer that as yes or no.
Well, yeah, it's a matter of personal belief, right? It's do you believe it, yes or no? If so, why or why not? The why or why not definitely gets into the nitty-gritty of...
I definitely believe it's not true. Okay, so
you believe that there's a logical contradiction. Sure.
Yeah, we'd have to go through
that's a
reams
whole...
of information. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we've opened up a couple... Sorry, yeah, go ahead, Dapper.
I was going to say, for my part, I'll say that I think that there are numerous God concepts that do not logically contradict the idea of evolutionary, like evolution, broadly speaking, biological evolution. I do think that there are some that do. And so I think one of the problems is that when you say, does the idea of God contradict X? One of the problems is
Even
that
more
there's not just
specific.
one concept. Yeah, there are multiple God concepts that have been proposed, and there are also more or less an infinite number of God concepts that have not been proposed, but that could be. And are all of them incompatible with evolution? I can't see how that would possibly be the case.
No.
Is
No.
your particular God concept that you happen to believe in as a theist incompatible? That's a different question, and I do think the answer there could very well be yes, they are incompatible. For instance, I don't know exactly what Daniel's God concept is. I do think that it probably corresponds broadly to what I was talking about earlier with a Trinitarian God, but maybe his does contradict, and I wouldn't deign to speak for him, but like, yeah, it could be that your personal God concept contradicts.
Also, questions for another day, because I think we've opened a handful of different topics, like young Earth creationism, for example, and like the length of time for the Earth's existence or events in the Bible, etc., as well as we opened up abiogenesis. I think the only thing we didn't really open up a can of worms here was flat Earth. Let's not. Let's leave that one off pinned to the side for maybe like the next year and a half.
Or we could.
My only reply to that is, why are you wasting your life? Is all I can say to the flat earthers. Why are you wasting your life?
The one thing everybody agrees on. The one thing that everybody agrees on. I'm here for it.
Here's the thing, though. I just Saturday, I coined the term wrong earther. And it is a term that encompasses both young earthers and flat earthers. Because the thing is, thinking that the Earth is 750,000 times younger than all of the evidence points to isn't really more ridiculous than thinking that the Earth has a shape that's different than what all of the actual measurements of the Earth.
And if I do not cut Dapper off here, he is going to go off on these cans of worms for eternity. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Perhaps Daniel will be kind enough to grace us with his presence again. Perhaps with these two, perhaps with other people. We'll see what's going on. Thank you so much. Like and subscribe. There's so much shit going on. Go check out everybody's links down in the description below. Thank you, all three of you, for joining me today. This has been wonderful. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did too, out there who's been watching. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation too. And we are going to get out of here. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Say goodbye, everybody.
Bye, guys. Bye.